Hi and welcome to RCKicks. On today's show, well, we've got a super exciting one for you. Yes, we're finally, and I'm sorry it's taken so long, we're going to be building the TRICKBITS YZ10-R. We're going to build it up from box to rolling chassis in this video, and then there'll be a follow-up video where I fitted the electronics and we take it for a shakedown. Also, at the end of this video, I'm going to compare it against an original one. Yes, I have an original one that this car was based on. So what we'll do when we finish building it up is we'll do a direct comparison and we'll go around the car looking at what's been changed, what's different, what's the same. So I thought that'd be quite interesting. So if you're interested in that, you better stay tuned. Right, so we kick off building the front and rear ball diff. As you can see, the machine parts for the outdrives, very sexy. I'd just like to say a massive thanks to Plague Bearings for sponsoring this video. I'm going to be fitting ceramic bearings to the YZ10-R, so it should be silky smooth. If you head over there, you can use RCKicks coupon at checkout and save yourself 10%. Now the first little gotcha, well, it almost got me, was in the center of the ball diffs. There's two bearings on each one and I left out one bearing. Don't ask me why, but I managed to find it just before I closed up the ball diffs. Also, I realized I actually had upgraded balls for the ball diffs. So off camera, I opened them up again and swapped all the balls out. That's why you'll probably notice that the balls will be different colors in different shots. Now, a few little tips when you're building up your ball diff: build it over a container like this, so when you drop them, you don't lose them. Also, I put a little bit of grease on the end of my Allen key, and that will let me pick up each ball individually and give me a little bit more control. Now, the actual bolt that runs through the ball diffs that clamps it together has been bent deliberately. The idea is that it causes more stress inside as you thread it through, so it won't back off. Obviously, you don't want to put Loctite on this, because if you put too much Loctite on it, you won't be able to adjust them down the line. So the idea is having them slightly bent means that they will hold themselves in position without backing themselves off. So there you go, I think that's a good enough starting point. I'm just going to test them to make sure that they run freely, and if they're silky smooth, it's time to move on. Just to cover all the keyboard warriors out there, just to let you know, I am no pro builder. This is just for entertainment purposes, so if you see that I've done something wrong, well, I did something wrong and it's my kit, so I'll figure it out at some point. Right, I think that pretty much covers it. Back to the video, and as you can see, the carbon chassis is a very different design to the original. When it arrives, you actually get the slipper clutch built already for you, so you can just drop it straight into the car. Now, I did dismantle this myself to swap out all the bearings for ceramic. Now, as you can move the motor mount backwards and forwards to set the tensions on the belts, I just set it in the central position for now. Then I've just gone and fitted the uprights for the top deck. Now, after I've fully built the car, I will go back and Loctite up some of the bolts that need it, but I wanted to do it without adding Loctite in case I made a mistake, and then it would just make my life a lot more difficult to fix it later on. Now, I'm pretty sure you'll agree with me, it's a good looking bit of kit, isn't it? Right, now we turn our attentions to fitting the arms. For the eagle-eyed of you, you'll notice that these arms are very different to the standard YZ10. We'll talk about these more in the end of this video when we do a direct comparison with a vintage YZ10. Now I have the optional race tuning set, which gives me different angles for my caster blocks, rear pivots, but for now we'll set it up pretty neutral, and then later on down the road when we start taking it to the track, we'll start dialing it in. TRICKBITS also do a spring set, so I'll order that soon because obviously dialing in the shocks is quite important. Now, another little thing that could get you is the actual drive shafts. They're different lengths. There is shorter ones. The shorter ones go on the rear and the longer ones go on the front. Now, I did think I might have to drill out some of the holes, but the pivot pins went through no problems at all, and I had no issues with binding at all. Everything flowed really well, but I didn't get any slop either, so I was really impressed, as I was expecting to use a lot more shims in this build. Now, I was upgrading my DB-01 the other day, and one thing that was really annoying was bearing slop. In the upright, when you put the bearing in it, it sits in the space, but it actually moves around a little bit and causes a lot of play. Very happy to report I didn't see the same thing here. The bearings are snug. They do take a little bit to push them in, but once they're home, there's no slop at all. Now when you're fitting these hubs, you have to make sure you put the right one in the right location. There's 2 thinner ones and 2 wider ones. The wider ones go on the front and the thinner ones go on the rear. Also, the nuts do up bidirectionally. What I mean by that is that you put the correct one on the right side, so when the wheel is rotating forward, it's always going to be tightening that nut. Now, when I first saw this pivot pin, I thought in manufacturing they'd missed out the E-clip on the other side, as the manual references an E-clip on both sides. But the upgraded version that you see here uses a different method. There is no E-clip on the outside, it uses an external bumper to actually lock it in place. But obviously in the manual it references the vintage version, which is a bit different. So that's one down. We've just got to make another one exactly the same for the other side. Now, as you can see here, fitting the bearings very snug. Like I said previously, there's no slop, but getting the bearings in can be a little bit tricky, but don't get too heavy-handed with the bearings. You don't want to damage them. Don't just ram it home. If you need to, use a bit of lube. Now, I chose the blue anodizing as I'm a bit of a Tamiya fanboy, so I love the blue upgraded parts. But you do have lots of choices. You can have red, then there's the plain aluminium color, silver if you will, blue, and then I'm sure there was another one, but I can't remember what color it was. Now, I didn't know at the time, but I found out these are actually titanium turnbuckles that you get in the kit. Now, I always put a little tiny bit of lube on them. Oil, not lube, oil on them. Jesus. Because if the friction builds up, when you're adjusting them in the car, you can end up popping them off the ball joints instead of adjusting them, and that just turns into a bit of a pain. So just putting a little bit of lube at the oil end on the threads really helps down the line to make adjusting the actual toe-in or the camber much smoother. Check out my fancy tools. Haven't I come far? Well, actually, they were gifted to me from a viewer who just couldn't stand me using random tools anymore. Kind of understandable, I guess. But a massive thanks, you know you are. So there you go, that's the rear arms all done. Now we turn our attentions to fitting the rear ball diff housing. And doesn't it look fancy? So we have to separate it to fit the bottom part to the actual chassis first. So there's just a few screws to fit at the bottom, fits in nice and snug. And that's done. Now we've done that, we can move on to actually fitting in the rear ball diff. Oh, it's exciting. Now I have to confess I did a stupid thing here. The belt that you're actually looking at is from a vintage YZ10, not the TRICKBITS YZ10-R. Alby from TRICKBITS had actually put the vintage belt in the tuning pack so that I could demonstrate to you the difference between the vintage belts and the modern belts. And I was stupid enough to think that it was actually some kind of toughened belt or upgrade belt, so I fitted it. Obviously I swapped it out when I realised. Anyway, glossing over that and moving swiftly on, the rear ball diff is in and it's connected up, running nice and smooth, so that's good to see. Next we turn our attentions to fitting the rear arms, which is pretty straightforward. It's just 4 bolts and that's done too. So once that's finished, we can turn our attentions to fitting the rear tower. And it's a hefty lump of carbon, so hopefully it should stand up to some modern racing and my driving style. Now this is a little different to the vintage YZ10, so I'm going to fit 4 bolts now, the 2 higher ones that you see here, and then there's 2 lower ones. You can also see the anti-roll bar mount is different as well from the original. Now the tower's fitted to the chassis, we can add the modern rear wing mounts. This is done by 4 bolts, 2 on each wing mount. Now we're finishing up on the rear for now, and we're turning our attentions to the front ball diff housing. Now mounting this to the chassis is exactly the same as what we did on the rear one. There's 4 bolts that hold the bottom tray in place. The additional bolt you see in the bottom left hand corner, I just put that there to hold it. As I have the camera right in my face, sometimes to get the shot I am compromised and I don't have enough space to use both my hands at the same time without just blocking the shot. You wouldn't normally fit this when you're building it for yourself. Now that's finished, we can turn our attentions to fitting the front drive belt. This doesn't take that long to actually get on and it's pretty straightforward. You don't have to remove the rear belt at all, you just slide it over, connect it back up again, put the bearing back in place and the top mount holder, whatever you want to call that. Then we can drop the diff into the front and then we have drive to both diffs. Now the diff can only be fitted in one direction. It's pretty obvious as there's actually a cutout in the chassis. Now you won't have to fight with the belt tension. It's actually quite low when you actually fit it in its default position. It's only when you adjust the bearing carrier later on that you can add a bit more tension. Now we've just got to test it to make sure it's silky smooth, and if it is, we're golden. Then we can turn our attentions to fitting the front arms. So first we have to fit the pivot pins for the top arms. No issues here. Again, the pivot pin went straight through, no binding. Super happy with that. Then we move on to the actual camber adjustment mounts. I did struggle with these a little bit, not sure why, but I managed to get there in the end with them. Yes, the battery died in my calipers, so I had to do manual readings. Typical, but it's only a starter basic calibration for now. We'll dial it in down the road. And just like that, the top arms are all done. So what do? Well, we fit the diff housing and the top arms to the chassis, and then we can do the lower arms. And just like that, it's starting to look like an RC car, and our hard work's paying off. Next, we turn our attentions to fitting the hubs. And I'm lucky enough to have a set of the option alloy hubs to fit. So we just slot the two bearings in, add the drive shaft, then put the hub on. After that, we're pretty much ready to assemble the rear arms. Now they're looking pretty beefy, and hopefully they're going to stand up to some abuse. By now you know the drill. We just fit the pivot pin to the bottom arm and slide it in. As you can see here, there's only one C-clip, and that C-clip goes on the outside, not the inside, because the actual bumper section holds it in place. So the pivot pin will not go towards the center of the car, it's locked in place. Now, one aspect that can be a real pain is to get the hubs correct. What I mean by that is that you don't want them to be binding in any way whatsoever, but you don't want to get lots of slop. Now, sometimes you have to shim them up to get them to sit right, but then sometimes you end up shimming them and then you have more binding. But I'm happy to report here, no issues at all. Like you, I had my reservations with 3D parts, but after fitting these together, the fit and the finish has been really on point. I've had no issues with things binding, lining up, nothing. They've gone together perfectly. Now, I don't know how strong they are and how long they're going to last, especially with my driving, but we're going to find out. But apparently this was never designed as a shelf queen, it's designed to be an out-and-out racer. Now, as you can see, I've got no binding in these arms, and it's not like I needed to spend ages filing things down, drilling out holes, or anything like that whatsoever. Now the arms are fitted, we can turn our attentions to the front tower. 4 bolts, 2 at the top and 2 underneath. And now is the perfect time to fit the optional anti-roll bars. Now I did make quite a few mistakes with the anti-roll bars, and the main one is there's a center alignment bracket that I didn't fit. So after I fitted the anti-roll bars, I had to open them all up again to take it out to then slide on that bracket before refitting them. So make sure you fit that first. It goes right in the center and it's a little black collar. As I'm going to be running on flat carpet, I actually went with quite stiff anti-roll bars for now, and we'll just have to see how we get on. Obviously, I've got a selection, so we can change them out as we go. Now, I haven't weighed the buggy yet. I haven't fitted the electronics, so I don't know how close to the minimum four-wheel drive weight it will have. But being that this design seems to have quite a lot of big bolts in it, I think upgrading them to titanium could really lighten up this buggy. Now, another part that came pre-built in the kit was the steering. And after having a good look at it, it's a work of art, and there's no slop in this whatsoever, so I was really impressed. Fitting it is simple, there's just 2 bolts that go through the bottom of the chassis. It really is that easy. After that, we just fit the turnbuckles, and that's the steering pretty much done for now. Now we can turn our attentions to fitting the battery tray. Now apparently the carbon fiber one you see here is the upgraded version. Originally these were in anodized alloy. Personally, I actually quite like the look of those, so I may end up downgrading and picking up one of the anodized blue ones if there's any available, as I just like my blue bling. Also in the kit you get both options. As you can see here, I've actually fitted a low center of gravity battery which works fine, but there is taller towers when you fit a normal hard case shorty. Now we're finally on the home straight, so we turn our attentions to the suspension. I fitted the rims to the car more for myself, just to make me feel like I'm getting further along than I actually am, as it's a little motivation to push on to get it looking like a finished car. Now the kit came with 2 sets of springs from Wheel Speed. Now I'm not sure if these are going to be the correct ones that I'm going to use when I go carpet racing, but I'll fit them for now, and then when I buy the spring kit I can adjust them at the track later on. One thing a lot of you recommended that I use, and I've been using it for a while now, is the green slime. When you're building up your shocks, using a little bit of this stops the oil leaking out and keeps your setup consistent. Now a lot of you have given me feedback on building up shocks, and the few other tips that kind of come through when you actually fitting the gaskets that you see here. Make sure you put them the right way around. Every single shock has a different set and what comes first, so double check the manual to make sure you put them in the correct order. The next big one is don't put the cap on until you push the piston through, as when you put the cap on it can compress it down, and then when you push the piston through afterwards you can tear the gaskets with the thread of the end of the piston. So put the piston in while everything is still soft and not compressed like I've just done there, then put the cap on afterwards. Also don't forget to put the gasket on the cap as well, otherwise when you put the cap on it will still leak. I found these Yokomo shocks to go together very well, super easy to put together and bleed. Obviously there's a bleed screw on these which makes your life so much easier when you're trying to set them up at the end when you've fitted your oil. So there you go, that's put together. Now we can add some oil. Another little tip that I was given is once the oil is filled and all the air has escaped, move the piston up and down 4 or 5 times quite quickly and look to see if there's any new air that's been sucked in from the bottom. If that's the case, you know you've got a leak at the piston end. If you don't do that, you put it all together and as you're driving the car, the air slowly gets trapped in the oil and then the damper performs differently. You gotta love a bleed screw. It makes setting up the shocks so much easier to make sure that you don't get any issues with the piston being locked in position or trapped air. It just makes life so much easier. Now all we've got left to do is fit the springs and attach them to the car. So now's a good time I think to reflect on the build and how it went. Putting the car together I think is amazing. I had no issues whatsoever. It's just like a mass-produced high-quality race buggy that you see. If I compare it against my B6.4 that I built recently, well, about a year ago, it is definitely on point with that, so you'll have no issues with fit and finish whatsoever. My only negative side, if I'm getting nitpicky, is the manual. The manual is a mixture of the YZ10 original car manual that's a bit blurry, and obviously this car has been adapted from that, so some things that are in that manual are not relevant for this car, and there's a little bit more guesswork in building this than I'd like to see, which did take away from the pleasure of building this. I think if I had a good manual, it would be one of the nicest and easiest builds that you can do. So hopefully this is something that's going to be rectified down the line, but really the difficult stuff is done. So getting the manual right is a lot easier than getting the car right, and the car is bang on point, so I can't knock it in any way from that point of view. Everything is just seamlessly connects together, no forcing, no adapting, no grinding, no bending to get the screws in. So the last few touches to do is to finish off the anti-roll bars. So I fitted the mounts, and then we've just got the connecting part that connects the bar to the lower arm, clip them into place, and that's another thing ticked off. Now I'm going to order a new set of rims and tyres and inserts so that when I'm ready to take it racing, I've got the correct tyres for it. I'm thinking about going for some JC Racings, Yokomo, the ones with the rivs that go down the front of it in pink. I'll keep these white ones so that when eventually I retire this car and it goes on the shelf, I can put these kit rims back on it. You notice now I'm fitting the front bumper, well, mounting point, and that's what holds the 2 front pins in place. This is obviously different to the vintage version. One of the last things to do before we fit the top deck is to fit the servo bracket mount. Now on the original vintage version, you literally just double-sided tape the servo down to the chassis. Obviously with modern servos, this is not really going to cut it. So what TRICKBITS have done is they've created a servo mount that basically clamps the servo to the chassis. You still have to use double-sided tape on the mount and on the bottom of the servo, but it's definitely going to hold it in place a lot better than the vintage version, which is just stuck down. Now that's in place, we can actually fit the top deck. Now there's two blue anodized alignment pins that you've got here. These don't actually hold the body down, it just aligns it. But obviously you have to fit those to the top deck before you fit the top deck to the car, otherwise you can't get a screwdriver in to tighten them up. As we're now coming to the end of building the chassis up, I turn my attentions to the body. Now this kit came with a fully painted body that needs cutting out, as well as the under tray needs to be cut out, cleaned and painted. But guess who forgot he doesn't have any black PS paint, so that'll have to wait for another day. So I cut them out, cleaned them and just put them to one side. Then it's just a case of trimming out the body, fitting the chassis protector that you see here, which went on really easy. And then we're pretty much done. Cutting the body out, you've got to be a little bit careful, as the back section you need to cut all the way inside the valley at the back there. That takes a little bit of time and effort to get right. Whoever does the painting for TRICKBITS really knows what they're doing. These bodies are stunning. They're painted to a really high standard, so you've got to be a bit careful not to mess it up. So let's compare the two cars against each other. Now there's bound to be hundreds of little tiny changes, so I'm sure I'm going to miss one or two, but I'll try and cover as many as I can remember off the top of my head. So we'll start from the front of the car and then work our way back. So the first thing is the tower. The carbon tower is thicker on the TRICKBITS one, obviously to meet the rigorous bigger jumps that we see these days in the carpet tracks. The bumper on the original one, whereas the new one, what they've done is they've removed the bumper but kind of integrated the bumper to hold the pivot pins, so it's kind of doing two jobs. Whereas the previous one, the pivot pins were actually clipped on both sides. Now on the new car it's only on one side. The next one, and it's a big one, is the shocks. Now the big bore shocks, they're obviously a lot more modern to meet the modern demands of the tracks we see today versus the tracks back in the day. Now because of the big bore shocks, there's actually been quite a lot of work that's had to be done, not just swap the shocks out. The actual arms have got scallops cut into them to be able to accept the big bore shocks, so that is a big change in the actual front arms. Next thing you're probably going to notice is actually the mounts for the wheels. Now the traditional Yokomo 2 screw mounts, I do like this. I have run this quite a lot, but every now and again the screws can pop out. It can be a bit of an issue that will ruin your race. This one is a single large bolt that obviously you undo it in the direction of the tire, so they're multi-direction depending on which side of the car you go on. The back mount is scalloped out as well to save a bit of weight. Don't know if the actual uprights are different, don't think so. I've got the upgraded alloy hubs on this one. Then we move back a little bit. The actual top deck isn't massively different. The only thing I can see that's different on this is obviously you've got two sort of alignment pins for the body, and then where it actually mounts onto the rear pinion and spur motor mount, there's actually slots cut in this one, because we'll come back to why in a little while. The steering is pretty much the same, just cleaned up a lot. So there's a lot less parts to do the same thing, especially on the other side. Now I don't know if this was the same on all the original cars, but if I do a close-up here, you can see all the different bolts and parts, whereas this one is much more simpler and just modernized. Now another thing that's a bit kooky about these is the servo, how you fit the servo. In the original car, you stuck it down and that was it. There's no ears to use or anything like that. Now obviously that's not the best solution, so what TRICKBITS have done is, yes, you still have to stick it down, but they've made a top brace as well, so you can clamp it between the top brace and the bottom and you stick it on, and there's actually some sticky pads on the top brace as well, and that will hold it much more secure. Obviously, you're probably going to be running a lot more powerful and a lot faster servo, so you need that extra grip. Another big one is the saddle packs have been removed and given you a standard lipo. Now you can run a shorty lipo pack. That's actually more difficult than you think, because the way the car was originally designed to have saddle packs, and the belt runs right down the middle, but they've managed to get it in. Another thing that's really nice is you can actually adjust the mount to get it as close as you can to the spur gear, but without touching it. So depending on how you line it up, you can actually move this, you can swing the battery in and out. Modern slipper clutch, obviously. Now, one of the biggest changes that they've made is that you can tension the front and rear belt. On the original vintage car, you couldn't tension the rear belt. So they've made it that it actually slides, the motor mount slides forward and backwards. If you want to tension the back, you bring the whole motor mount forward, and then if you want to tension the front belt, you raise or lower this bearing carrier here. Obviously, the standoffs have all been upgraded to be aluminium and anodized to make them look all pretty. Then we go to the back of the car. The rear tower, like at the front one, is thinner. Also, the towers on this are kind of sprung loaded. They've got on the back, they're kind of held in with rubber bushes, so that if you hit them, they do actually flex. Obviously, running much thicker carbon, you don't have to worry about that, so that's been changed as well. So they've removed this whole mount across the top here, as well as the mount at the back is just now bolts. If we flip the cars over, another big aspect that I haven't fitted yet is that the tray, the under tray, has been redesigned to be just on the side. The reason for that is that when you have the car up the other way, you don't have this bottom bulge. You have the bottom of the chassis, so you can get the car nice and low if you're going to be running in carpet. As you can see, the front bumper is removed on this one. And then it's the same on the rear. The rear arms have been adapted to take the big bore shocks, where on the original ones, it's mounted inside the actual arms. The rear wing mounting has been changed to a much more modern design from the original. The original was just a push fit, and the modern one is basically what you're used to seeing today. Another upgrade that's been done to the YZ10-R is the belts. The original belt size has been improved on. So this is an original belt, and as you can see, the new belt is much thicker. But what I'm really happy with is I like that it is faithful to the original, but just polished and dialed in with a much more modern twist to it. So there you go, built to a roller, the TRICKBITS YZ10-R. In the next episode, the plan is to fit electronics in it and then give it a bit of a shakedown. Now I plan on fitting Corsa electronics in it, the same as what I run in my modern PR racing buggy. So if you'd like to see that, don't forget to like and subscribe, coming soon. Thanks very much, see you on the next one.